The next group that we would like to focus on in the religious community are the Christians. Let me start by saying that Israelis often wonder why the Europeans are not more attached to the Christians in Lebanon, for example. In reality, there is some attachment, especially on the part of French and especially toward the Maronites. But the fact of the matter is that there is no qualitatively equivalent phenomena to that of an ummah that exists for the Muslim. There is no qualitatively equivalent phenomena among the Christians. And therefore, the attachments are not going to be the same as the ones you're going to find among Muslims. Now, the largest Christian community in the Middle East by far would be the Copts, the Coptics. The Coptics are mainly in Egypt, and they comprise about approximately 10% of Egypt. Some have disputed this number, arguing that it's half of that. But I think the consensus is around 10%, so that's what I'll go with. They represent an ancient Christian community, and as a group coming into modern era, they were far less attracted to Arab nationalism than the Muslims were. And remember, manifestation of nationalism on the part of the core population a lot of times scares the minority because they are worried about being viewed as not sufficiently committed to the national cause, and therefore the possibility of pogroms or possibilities of genocide could arise. So nationalism on the part of the core population oftentimes scares the minority in these nations. The second group are the Maronites. They have, in this conflict between Arab Israelis, often been the allies of Israel. They are Roman Catholics in terms of their faith, but from the Eastern rites. And among them, there have been a lot of people who have been fighting with each other. As we talk about, there are various gangs with them. And when we get to the identity of these people, you will see that it's very, very parochial, even though they're a modern group. It's one of those paradoxes. The next group are the Orthodox, and under the Orthodox, I would include three subgroups. One of them would be the Melkites, and these are Eastern Christians, mostly located in Syria, and they adhere to Chalcedonian Orthodoxy. The other are the Greek Orthodox, and there are a lot of them in Lebanon. And then the last group are the Armenians. Each of these groups that I mentioned under the Christian faith, they have very strong attachment to their own community rather than to Christianity per se. And as I mentioned with the Maronites, all of them have fought a lot of civil wars amongst each other. And you can imagine poor Lebanon has all of these groups in it. So it's a challenge for Lebanon to become a nation state. And yet, when we discussed Lebanon, for at least a brief period, they almost had overcome these divisions. Alas, it didn't last very long. And then the last group are the Jews, the Judaism or the Jewish community. And one thing important about the Jewish community is that it qualitatively really does resemble the Ummah in the Islamic world. Approximately there are about 13.5 to 14 million Jews globally. About 37% of them live in Israel, but overwhelming majority, 64%, live in diaspora. And in the United States alone, 46% of the Jewish population lives in, actually North America, I should say, includes Canada. So there are more of them in North America than in Israel. What is important about the Jewish community from the perspective of identity is that even irreligious Jews, atheist Jews, still can view themselves as part of the Jewish community. So the notion of being a Jew really does transcend the religion itself. And this fact alone, I would argue, is a major source of strength for the Jewish community in ways that it's not the case for the Christian community. So the next, or the last, I should say, community base of identity is the territorial community. And the territorial community refers to the community that exists in the state boundary. This is much more likely to occur. In other words, identity on the basis of the territory or attachment to territory is much more likely to occur in the Western Hemisphere than in the Eastern Hemisphere. And the question is why? What is it special about the Western Hemisphere that has led to that kind of an attachment to the territory itself than to other bases of community like ethnicity, race, and religion? The answer to the why question, I believe, is because the Western Hemisphere has been much more populated by immigrant states. The states here are really all immigrant states in which the population came from the Eastern Hemisphere and began to populate the area. A good example of a nationalistic identity that is based on attachment to territory, in other words, the territorial community being the base of nationhood, is the United States itself. The United States is multiracial, it's multi-religious, and it's multi-ethnic. A lot of us, actually, if we're honest, don't like each other's races, don't like each other's ethnicity or religion. But the fact remains that a great majority of us will unite on the basis of our attachment to the territorial community. So that when the chips are down, we are all Americans and we are willing to defend the territory. Therefore, the basis of nationalism, in fact, the basis of nationhood for the United States is territory, attachment to territory. In U.S., the division across race, religion, and ethnicity all actually militate against the development of a strong sense of nationalism. And yet, these divisions are not sufficiently strong enough to overcome a more intense attachment that we all feel toward the territory. And as Americans, if I can digress for a moment, we often are not fully cognizant. We are not always fully aware of just how nationalistic we are. The analogy I use to explain that phenomena is this. Think of nationalism in the same way you think of a volcano, a dormant volcano. Most of the times when there are no challenges in ordinary times, the volcano is dormant. But then when you get a major challenge, suddenly it erupts. So effervescence of nationalism oftentimes awaits the challenges that has to be faced by a nation, and then once that challenge is manifest, then you will see nationalistic behavior. Now, an important phenomena in this context is this, and that is territory is emerging as a competing base for community identity in much of Middle East. In other words, territory is now in the Middle East beginning to compete with ethnicity and with religion as a rival base of identity. And that should not be surprising because if you recall, the imperialists that conquered much of the Middle East, they decided to divide most of the Arab nations into a series of artificial states. So in that sense, Syria is not a nation state the same way we are. It was created by the French out of what used to be Greater Syria, that encompasses not just Syria, but Lebanon and Israel, Jordan. All of that area used to be called the Greater Syria. So for Syria, the question is, are they Arab or are they Syrian? In other words, is it their ethnicity or is it the territory? So they are ambivalent, and you will see that ambivalence among a lot of Arabs in the Middle East. Which brings me to a very important point related to identity, not just territorial, but the whole bigger point about identity itself. And that is the notion of what I call compound identity. Think of your identity as a compound consisting of more than one element. It could be both ethnic and religion, or ethnic, religion, and territory, or territory or religion and religion. So in that context, you can see that Syrians see themselves, in a sense, as both Arabs and Syrian. And you see that happening, for example, when they have to justify themselves sending troops to Lebanon during after 1957 civil war in Lebanon. The Syrians sent troops there. If you ask Syrians, why did you go there? Many believe that they were going to Lebanon not to conquer it, but they were going there to reunite with their brothers. Other Syrians and Lebanese are quite happy with the division. In other words, for them, the territory is more important than ethnicity. Still others want to divide the land further. So, for example, Maronites may want to just create Mount Lebanon as the only place just reserved for them. So, with that said, the notion of compound identity, I want to go back and give you an example of a best nation state. That is one in which, in terms of the four bases of community, race, ethnicity, religion, and territory, there is virtually very little difference, very little variance for its population. My candidate for the best one is Japan. Very little division across race, very little division across ethnicity, religion, or territory. So Japanese are a prime example of what a true nation state in its optimal form would look like. I would also say Israel comes pretty close to that if you could exclude its Arab population. Remember, about 20% of Israelis are Arabs. And because Israel has this huge minority that actually despise them, it's going to be problematic. But without that minority, Israel would have pretty much fit the bill as coinciding with all of these four variables that I mentioned. Now, in the case of Israelis and Arab citizens in Israel, they really don't like each other, and that's a source of problem. The truth of the matter is, specific individuals, Arabs and Israeli individuals, they like each other. It's their public that don't like each other. And surveys back in the 80s indicated something close to 70% or more dislike and hatred. And today that number is even larger. I want to kind of end this part of my presentation with looking at Iraq's compound identity to get a sense of how Iraq is not a nation state in the same sense that we think of ourselves and Europe as a nation state. So let's look at the Iraq compound identity. On the ethnic base of nationhood, if you look at that, 80% of Iraqis are Arabs, but then 20% are Kurds. The Kurds are, if you recall, Indo-European people, and one of the problems for Iraq is that oil fields happen to be located where the Kurds are living. So that's a very important consideration as far as giving independence to Kurds are concerned. There's a serious economic factor involved. If you look at the other base of identity, religion, again you'll see in Iraq 60% are Shiites, clear majority. Actually, until the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States, the Shiites were the deprived minority. Actually, deprived majority, let me correct that. And after 2003, with the election that followed afterwards, the Shiites are now the ruling majority. They used to be the clear underdogs, even though in terms of size they were a majority. The other group, of course, are Sunnis, and Sunnis are 40%. A good bunch of the Sunnis, close to 20%, are Kurds, because Kurds are mostly Sunnis in Iraq. This is the group, about 20% of Arab Sunnis. So the Arab Sunnis are 20%, the other 20% are the Kurds. These 20% were the group that dominated Iraq politically. So the 20% Sunni Arabs were the people who, under Saddam, were able to control politically Iraq's fortune. And they formed the core base of support for Saddam Hussein when he ruled Iraq. Finally, the last factor, of course, is territory. And with respect to territory, the way I'm defining that is attachment to the boundaries of Iraq, which was created by the British out of 3 provinces. We'll talk more about that. Again, before 1932, there was no such thing as Iraq as a state. And in terms of territory, Iraqi nationalists, these are the people whose primary attachment goes to the territory, the boundaries that is Iraq. I have made a kind of an educated guess, or maybe not so educated guess, putting at about 65%. That suggests, if I'm right, that the notion of territorial identity has taken roots in Iraq. I put Arab nationalists at about 35%. The Kurds wouldn't be part of it, and most of the Arab nationalists would be Sunni anyway. And for the Arab nationalists, what matters is the unity of the Arabs. Again, this is at best a guesstimate, and I'm not willing to really say much more on that and defend that, because you really need good survey data in order to be able to address this. So the kind of picture that I just presented to you in terms of various compound identities that goes into the makeup of the Iraqis' identity, it's the kind of picture that you get practically all over the Middle East. This is a typical picture in much of the Arab world. And with this kind of a picture, in identity picture, you will get sometimes strange behaviors that are hard for us to decipher. For example, you will see that a lot of the Arabs are inclined to believe in a conspiratorial interpretation of world politics. And when you're inclined to that and you go through the identity change, the very change process, whether it's identity or whether it's value or other remaining changes that we're going to discuss, it will tend to exacerbate the problem. So you have to understand that a lot of things you see in the Middle East reflects that exacerbation that I mentioned. For example, the intensity of the kind of fighting that one saw in Lebanon back in the 70s and 80s is really a modern phenomena, even though the roots of the problem are sectarian and goes back. That kind of a killing, that kind of a mayhem really didn't exist in the past in the Middle East. It's a modern phenomena, and I'll submit to you that it is a reflection of identity change, especially for much of the Shiites in Lebanon that have become now the largest minority group.